My mother-in-law stood in front of 200 people at the most exclusive country club in Atlanta, tapped her crystal champagne flute, and announced that I was a piece of trash. She did not stop there. She pulled out her phone, dialed my father, and put him on speaker for the entire ballroom to hear. "Come pick up your burden." She laughed, her voice echoing over the silent crowd. The elites of the city stared at me, waiting for the tears, waiting for the complete meltdown of the truck driver's daughter. I did not give them the satisfaction. I did not yell, and I did not cry. I just took a slow sip of my red wine, crossed my legs, and waited. Exactly 30 minutes later, her smug smile vanished. Cell phones across the room began ringing simultaneously. Faces turned chalk white, knees literally buckled. Because what my arrogant mother-in-law and my cheating husband did not realize was that in their desperate attempt to publicly destroy me, they had just handed me the keys to their entire empire. I am Zoe, 32 years old, and before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe that toxic people always end up digging their own graves. You will definitely want to stick around to hear how a single signature completely leveled a family of fake aristocrats. Growing up, my life was built on the grit and grease of my father's hard work. My dad, Elias, started with a single rusty truck hauling whatever he could to put food on our table. To the outside world, and especially to my husband Marcus and his snobby family, my father was just a blue-collar nobody. They looked down on him, and by extension, they looked down on me. What they completely failed to understand was that my father did not just drive a truck. He used that single vehicle to build Owens Freight, a nationwide logistics and private equity empire. He raised me to understand the brutal realities of business and risk. So while my husband and his mother spent their days obsessing over designer labels, country club memberships, and maintaining their image as Atlanta old money, I was quietly operating as the director of risk management for a massive investment firm. I managed portfolios worth more than their entire bloodline. But I kept that a secret. I wanted to see who they truly were when they thought they held all the power. My marriage to Marcus had been a carefully constructed illusion. He was a plastic surgeon, the golden child of the Harrison family, polished on the outside, but entirely hollow on the inside. For years, I endured their microaggressions, the subtle jabs about my clothing, the backhanded compliments about my intelligence, and the constant reminders that I should feel lucky to even share their air. I stayed quiet, absorbing their toxicity, documenting every lie, and tracking every single one of their reckless financial decisions. I knew Marcus was drowning in secret debt. I knew his mother Beverly was using the family estate as a personal piggy bank to fund her lavish lifestyle. They were a house of cards pretending to be a fortress. The breaking point arrived on what was supposed to be a night of celebration. The Harrison family was hosting a lavish anniversary gala for their highly profitable plastic surgery clinic. The Oak Ridge Country Club was dripping in forced wealth that night. Towering floral arrangements covered every surface. Waiters passed around expensive appetizers, and the women wore dresses that cost more than a down payment on a house. I sat at the head table wearing a simple but elegant black gown, feeling the cold stares of my in-laws burning into the side of my head. Beverly was entirely in her element. She paraded around like the absolute queen of the city, introducing Marcus to everyone as the brilliant savior of the medical field. She completely ignored my existence until the very end of the night. I knew my marriage was over long before that evening. I had known for months about his infidelities and his hidden bank accounts. But I attended the gala to keep up appearances of final courtesy before we quietly filed the paperwork. Beverly, however, had other plans. She never missed an opportunity for theater. She wanted to humiliate me, to cast me out publicly, so she could rewrite the narrative and make me the villain. She wanted to prove once and for all that a working-class girl could never survive in her world. She stepped up to the microphone, her heavy diamond necklace catching the chandelier light, and thanked the local politicians and the old money families. Then she turned her cold, calculating gaze directly toward me, her lips curling into a wicked smile. That was the exact moment she initiated the 30-minute countdown to her own absolute destruction. Beverly gripped the microphone tightly, her knuckles white beneath her massive diamond rings. She cleared her throat, ensuring all eyes in the room were locked onto her. "We have always prided ourselves on our philanthropy," she began, her voice dripping with fake sincerity. "The Harrison family believes in lifting up those who come from nothing. 5 years ago, my son Marcus brought home a stray. A girl whose father spent his entire life hauling trash and sweating in a rusty truck just to afford basic groceries. We tried to polish her. We tried to teach her how to exist in polite society, but unfortunately you can never wash the dirt off someone who was born in the mud." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. Some of the older socialites covered their mouths, while others leaned in closer, hungry for the drama. My heart beat steadily. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with Beverly. I simply stood up from my chair and slowly walked toward the stage. My heels clicked rhythmically against the marble floor. I held my head high, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me cower. When I reached the front of the room, Beverly did not back down. She signaled to a waiter who brought over a silver tray. Sitting right in the middle of it was a thick stack of legal documents. Beverly grabbed the papers and threw them violently onto the table right in front of me. They hit the wood with a loud smack that echoed through the silent room. "That is a finalized divorce agreement," she announced into the microphone, not caring that 200 influential people were watching my public execution. "Marcus is officially engaged to Senator Hayes's daughter, a woman of actual pedigree, a woman who understands what it means to carry the Harrison name. So be a good girl, Zoe. Sign the papers. Take the $5,000 a month pity allowance we are generously offering you, and go back to the slums where you belong." Marcus stepped out from the shadows of the stage and stood right beside his mother. He looked immaculate in his tailored tuxedo, but his eyes were completely empty of any guilt. He did not even have the decency to look ashamed of what he was doing to his wife of 5 years. He simply smirked casually, adjusting his expensive gold cufflinks like he was bored of the entire situation. "Just sign it, Zoe," Marcus said, his voice loud enough for all the surrounding tables to hear clearly. "You always knew this was temporary. You never truly belonged here with us. Take the money. It is more than your father ever made in a decade of driving that pathetic truck." My chest remained perfectly still. I looked at the divorce papers. Then I looked up at Marcus. This was their grand master plan. To corner me in public, to use the crushing weight of peer pressure and profound social humiliation to force me into signing away my legal rights. They thought I was a helpless little girl who would crumble under the terrifying power of their social standing. They thought I would sign anything just to escape the stares of the Atlanta elite. I slowly reached into my clutch and pulled out my heavy Mont Blanc pen. I uncapped it with a soft click that somehow felt deafening in the silent room. I did not shed a single tear. I just smiled. It was a genuine and relaxed smile that made Beverly's eyes narrow in deep confusion. She expected a meltdown. She expected me to run out of the room crying. My calm demeanor was deeply unsettling to her. "Are you absolutely sure about this, Marcus?" I asked, my voice calm and perfectly steady. "Once I sign this, there is no going back for you." "Sign the paper and get out," he spat, losing his polished composure for just a fraction of a second. His jaw clenched tightly. I lowered the pen to the signature line. The trap was set perfectly, but they needed to dig the hole just a little bit deeper before I pushed them in. Before the ink could even touch the paper, a hand suddenly slammed down on my shoulder. I did not have to turn around to know who it was. The overwhelming smell of cheap cologne and the aggressive grip told me everything I needed to know. It was Trent, my white brother-in-law, Chloe's husband. Trent fancied himself a financial genius, a high-rolling investment broker who constantly talked down to me because he assumed I was completely financially illiterate. "Come on, Zoe," Trent sneered, leaning in close so his voice carried across the silent crowd. "Just sign the damn papers and take the handout. With your blue-collar brain, you could never comprehend how to manage the Harrison family assets anyway. I am the chief financial officer of this family, and I know for a fact You do not have a single penny to your name. Just take the check and go give it to your truck-driving daddy. Maybe he can finally buy a new set of tires." Chloe, my arrogant sister-in-law, immediately chimed in from the front row. She swirled her champagne glass and laughed loudly. "Trent is right," she added maliciously. "Did you really think learning how to balance a checkbook made you equal to us? If it was not for Marcus's reputation as a top-tier doctor, you would probably be scrubbing toilets at a truck stop right now." The sheer audacity of their ignorance was almost poetic. Trent, the man who was secretly siphoning millions from his wife's trust fund to cover his catastrophic cryptocurrency losses, was lecturing me on wealth management. And Chloe, a woman who had never worked a single day in her 30 years of life, was insulting my intelligence. The tension in the room reached an absolute boiling point. Guests were whispering behind their hands, completely captivated by the cruel spectacle. I smoothly brushed Trent's hand off my shoulder, like brushing off a piece of lint. I stood up straight and looked him dead in the eye. "Trent," I said, my voice echoing clearly, "it is incredibly bold of you to lecture me on asset management while wearing a counterfeit Rolex." The entire room gasped. Trent's face instantly drained of color. He instinctively covered his left wrist with his right hand, stepping back as if he had been physically struck. "Yes," I continued, speaking slowly and deliberately. "The sweeping second hand on your supposedly authentic Daytona ticks instead of gliding. A rather embarrassing oversight for a man who claims to be the financial savior of this family. I suppose when your imaginary stock portfolio consists entirely of terrible crypto investments, you have to cut corners somewhere to keep up appearances." Trent opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He turned bright red, looking frantically at Chloe, who was now staring at his wrist in pure shock. Beverly let out a sharp gasp, completely furious that her perfect family image was being dismantled in front of her most important friends and investors. She realized she was losing control of the narrative and she panicked. She decided to go for the ultimate kill shot. She lunged forward, snatching my cell phone right off the table. "You ungrateful little brat," Beverly hissed, her perfectly manicured face twisting into an ugly scowl. "You think you can come into my club and disrespect my family? Let us see how brave you are when I show everyone exactly where you come from." Before I could stop her, she unlocked the screen using a passcode I foolishly thought was private. She scrolled through my contacts, tapped on my father's name, and hit the speakerphone button. She held the phone high in the air near the microphone so the dialing sound echoed through the massive speakers of the ballroom. Ring, ring, ring. The silence in the room was suffocating. Every single guest held their breath, waiting to see how the poor, uneducated truck driver would react to being publicly humiliated by the great Beverly Harrison. They expected a bumbling, confused old man. They expected him to beg for mercy or yell obscenities. I just stood there completely still, letting Beverly hang herself with her own rope. The line clicked open. "Yes, Zoe." My father's deep, steady voice filled the room. Beverly snatched the phone closer to her face and screamed into it. "Listen to me very carefully, Elias. Drive your smelly, pathetic truck down to the Oak Ridge Country Club right now and pick up your garbage daughter. The Harrison family is officially kicking her out. She has no class, no money, and absolutely no right to breathe the same air as the aristocracy of this city. Come collect your burden before I have security throw her onto the street." The entire ballroom braced for the explosive reaction. But there was no yelling. There was no swearing. There was only a low, dark chuckle from the other end of the line. It was the laugh of a man who held all the cards in a very high-stakes game. "Beverly," my father said, his tone entirely unfazed and dripping with quiet authority. "I raised my daughter to be patient. She told me to give you exactly 30 minutes to enjoy that last glass of champagne. I highly suggest you savor it. Because I am already in the parking lot." Beverly scoffed, completely underestimating the weight of his words. "You are delusional, old man," she spat violently, pressing the end call button. She turned back to the crowd, laughing nervously. Well, the apple truly does not fall far from the trash can. She thought she had won. She thought she had delivered the final crushing blow. She had no idea the timer had just started. She thought she had won. She thought she had delivered the final crushing blow. She had no idea the timer had just started. 5 minutes passed in a thick, uncomfortable silence. The orchestra tried to start playing again, but the music sounded hollow and weak against the heavy anxiety suffocating the room. Guests shifted in their seats, whispering furiously behind their napkins. I remained standing exactly where I was, my pen still in hand, completely unbothered. Beverly tried her best to mingle, forcing a tight plastic smile as she walked among the tables, but her eyes kept darting nervously toward the grand entrance doors. Marcus was pacing aggressively near the bar, downing a glass of scotch. He looked visibly rattled. Suddenly, the sharp ringing of a cell phone pierced the quiet air. It was not just any ringtone, it was Trent's phone blaring loudly from his tailored jacket pocket. He fumbled to pull it out, his face still flushed a deep crimson from the Rolex humiliation. He glanced at the caller ID, and every single ounce of color drained from his face instantly. He looked like he had just seen a ghost. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water, watching him carefully over the rim of my glass. "Answer it, Trent," I said smoothly, my voice carrying across the silent tables. It would be incredibly rude to ignore the Securities and Exchange Commission on such a festive night. Trent froze completely. The phone kept ringing, echoing through the ballroom. Chloe grabbed his arm, her manicured nails digging into his sleeve, demanding to know what was going on. He slowly swiped the screen with a trembling finger and brought the phone to his ear. I did not need to hear the voice on the other end to know exactly what they were saying. I had sent the audit files myself that very morning. Files that meticulously documented exactly how Trent had embezzled $4 million from the Harrison family savings, laundering it through a dummy shell company to cover his massive cryptocurrency gambling debts. Trent's knees literally buckled. He dropped the phone. It shattered on the marble floor, the screen cracking into a dozen pieces. Chloe began screaming at him, shaking his shoulders violently, demanding answers that he could not give. The golden couple of the Harrison family was publicly imploding right in front of the city's most elite gossips. Marcus angrily slammed his empty glass down on the wooden bar and marched toward me, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. "What the hell did you do?" he hissed, his face twisted in absolute rage. "This is your fault, you vindictive little brat." I did not even let him finish the sentence. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a thick red medical file. I slapped it hard against Marcus's chest, forcing him to catch it with both hands before it hit the floor. "You are so incredibly concerned with my background, Marcus," I said, my voice projecting clearly and confidently across the room. "Let us talk about your present. Specifically, let us talk about why you have not performed a single surgery in 6 months." Marcus stared at the red folder as if it were a venomous snake about to strike him. Beverly, sensing yet another disaster unfolding, rushed over her high heels, clicking frantically against the marble. "What is that?" she demanded, her voice shrill and panicked. "What lies are you spreading about my son now?" "No lies, Beverly," I replied calmly. "Just the official documentation from the state medical board. Your brilliant golden boy had his medical license revoked half a year ago for gross negligence and severe malpractice. He completely botched a facial reconstruction surgery and then tried to illegally falsify the patient medical records to cover it up." Loud gasps erupted from the VIP tables. Several wealthy clients who frequented the Harrison Clinic stood up from their chairs, looking completely horrified. Some began checking their own faces in their phone cameras. Marcus tried to shove the folder back at me, but I stepped aside, letting it fall open onto the white tablecloth for anyone to see. The official state seal was printed in bright red ink. "And that is not all," I continued, my tone conversational, but absolutely deadly. "You see, Marcus has been funding his lavish lifestyle and his new fiancée's enormous diamond ring using a black credit card, a card that his mother so proudly flaunts around town to pay for these ridiculous country club parties. But you forgot one tiny, crucial detail, Marcus." I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice just enough so he had to strain to hear it, forcing him to hang on my every word. "That black card is a corporate account under Owen's Freight. I am the primary guarantor. And I canceled it exactly 10 minutes ago." Marcus looked like he could not breathe. He stumbled backward, bumping hard into a waiter and sending a silver tray of champagne glasses crashing to the floor. The loud sound of shattering glass perfectly mirrored the total destruction of his carefully curated fake life. Beverly was hyperventilating now. "This is a trick," she screamed, pointing a shaking, desperate finger at me. "You are a liar. Security! Security! Get this lying piece of trash out of my club immediately. I want her thrown onto the street." The heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open. The club manager, a stern-looking man in a flawless tailored suit, stepped into the room. He was flanked by 4 large, intimidating security guards. Beverly let out a massive sigh of relief, gesturing wildly toward me as if I were a criminal. "Throw her out," she ordered the manager, her voice dripping with the arrogant entitlement she was so famous for. "She is causing a massive disturbance and insulting my family." But the manager did not look at me with anger. He did not reach for his radio. He walked straight past Beverly, completely ignoring her demands. He walked past Marcus, who was still staring blankly at the ruined medical files. The manager stopped directly in front of me, stood up straight, and bowed his head slightly in a deep show of respect. "Miss Owens," he said respectfully, his voice carrying just enough weight to cut through the whispers of the crowd. "Is this woman bothering you? We can have her escorted off your property immediately if you wish." Beverly stopped breathing. Her eyes bulged out of her head. The entire room seemed to tilt on its axis. "My property?" She choked out, her voice barely a whisper. She looked back and forth between me and the manager, her brain completely unable to process the words she had just heard. I smiled warmly at the manager. "Thank you, Charles, but that will not be necessary just yet. I want them to hear the rest of the story first." I turned my attention back to my mother-in-law, picking up the divorce papers she had thrown at me earlier. "You really should read the fine print before you try to ruin someone's life, Beverly," I said softly. "Because you just tried to kick me out of my own building." I let the heavy Mont Blanc pen hover just a millimeter above the signature line. My pause was entirely intentional. I needed to see exactly who else was going to reveal their true colors before I brought the entire house crashing down. I did not have to wait long. Seeing what he perceived as my weakness, Trent seized the opportunity to make himself the center of attention. Trent was my white brother-in-law married to Marcus's sister Chloe. He stepped out from the crowd of wealthy onlookers, adjusting the lapels of his custom Italian suit with a smug sense of self-importance. Trent fancied himself the ultimate financial genius of the Harrison family. He was a boutique investment broker who loved nothing more than using his proximity to a wealthy black family to prove how culturally aware and progressive he was, all while secretly looking down on everyone in the room. He suffered from a massive white savior complex, and tonight he had decided that I was his charity case. He walked right up to the head table and invaded my personal space without a second thought. He wrapped a heavy arm around my shoulders, squeezing slightly in a way that was meant to look comforting, but was actually incredibly patronizing. The overwhelming smell of his expensive musky cologne made my stomach turn. "Come on, Zoe," Trent said, his voice loud and artificially gentle so the entire ballroom could hear how reasonable he was being. "Just sign the document. We all know this is incredibly overwhelming for you." I kept my eyes on the paper, letting him dig his own grave. I did not move his arm. I just let him keep talking. "Look at it logically," Trent continued, leaning down, so his face was entirely too close to mine. "Managing the kind of generational wealth the Harrison family possesses is not like balancing a simple checkbook. We are talking about highly diversified asset portfolios, aggressive capital gains, tax strategies, and complex liquidity management. It is a totally different language. You are a smart girl, but let us be brutally honest here. You do not have the educational background or the pedigree to comprehend what it takes to protect this kind of capital." He paused, looking around the room to make sure the elite guests were nodding along with his brilliant financial analysis. They were. The older country club members were practically beaming at his condescension. Trent squeezed my shoulder again, dropping his voice into a fake tone of deep sympathy. "Your father is a hard worker, Zoe. Nobody is taking that away from him. But a guy who spends 40 years gripping a steering wheel and hauling freight just does not understand fiduciary duty or private equity scaling. That blue-collar mindset is baked into your DNA. You guys know how to survive, but you do not know how to build empires. If Marcus suddenly passed away and you were left in charge of the estate, you would probably liquidate the trust funds and put the cash in a savings account. It would be a financial disaster. The sheer audacity of his words hung in the air. He was standing in front of 200 people, intentionally demeaning the intellect of a black woman from a working-class background, parading his supposed superiority while smiling like he was doing me a massive favor. He was stripping away my dignity and wrapping it up in complex financial jargon so it sounded like professional advice instead of a racial and classist insult. My sister-in-law, Chloe, immediately chimed in from the front row, eager to support her brilliant husband. She swirled the champagne in her crystal glass and laughed loudly. "Trent is exactly right," she added maliciously. "Did you really think marrying a doctor magically made you an expert in asset allocation? If it was not for my brother lifting you out of that tragic little life of yours, you would probably be managing a fast food restaurant right now. You should be thanking us on your knees." I stood perfectly still, letting their insults wash over me. Inside my mind, I was laughing. The irony of the situation was almost too delicious to bear. Here was Trent, a man who loved throwing around words like liquidity and fiduciary duty, lecturing me on wealth management. What nobody in that room knew was that Trent was an absolute fraud. As the director of risk management for my firm, I had access to financial networks that Trent could not even dream of. I knew for a strict fact that his boutique investment firm was currently bleeding capital. I knew he had been secretly siphoning millions of dollars from Chloe's trust fund to cover his catastrophic cryptocurrency losses. He was broke, desperate, and standing on the edge of a federal indictment, yet here he was trying to explain the concept of money to me as if I were a child. "Just take the alimony," Trent urged, tapping the divorce paper with his index finger. $5,000 a month is a fantastic safety net for someone with your limited earning potential. Think of it as a severance package. I manage the portfolios for this family, and I am telling you right now, this is the most generous offer you are ever going to get. Take the check, go give it to your truck-driving daddy, and maybe he can finally expand his little delivery route. Do the smart thing, Zoe. Be a good girl and sign." The room was dead silent, waiting for my compliance. They all expected me to break. They expected the overwhelming weight of Trent's financial intimidation and Beverly's social destruction to crush whatever spirit I had left. They thought they had backed me into a corner where my only option was surrender. The guests watched us like we were animals in a zoo. The microaggressions were flying so fast and thick that I could practically feel them suffocating the air in the room. Several of Beverly's wealthy friends were whispering behind their hands, nodding in absolute agreement with Trent. In their eyes, I was exactly what Beverly and Trent said I was. A gold digger, a charity case, a girl who had gotten incredibly lucky to marry into royalty and was now being rightfully discarded because she could not keep up with the sophistication of high society. Marcus stood a few feet away, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked so incredibly pleased with himself. He loved watching Trent do his dirty work. Marcus had always been a coward when it came to actual confrontation. He preferred to let his mother and his brother-in-law wear me down, swooping in only at the end to claim the victory. You see, Trent continued, mistaking my silence for absolute submission. Money is an ecosystem. It requires nurturing foresight and a certain pedigree of intelligence to sustain. It is not just about making a paycheck. It is about understanding the global market, anticipating economic shifts, and protecting assets from inflation. These are concepts that require a formal education, Zoe. Not street smarts. Not whatever gritty life lessons your dad taught you while changing spark plugs in a greasy garage. You are playing a game that you do not even know the rules to. Every single word that came out of his mouth was a calculated strike at my foundation. He wanted to make me feel small. He wanted to remind me that no matter how elegantly I dressed or how quietly I behaved, they would always view me as the dirt beneath their expensive Italian leather shoes. But they had fundamentally misunderstood who I was. My father did not just teach me how to change a spark plug. My father taught me how to read a corporate balance sheet before I was 12 years old. He taught me how to identify a failing asset, how to restructure corporate debt, and most importantly, how to recognize when a competitor was over-leveraging their position out of pure arrogance. And right now, Trent was the most over-leveraged man I had ever met. I did not feel small. I did not feel intimidated. I felt an overwhelming sense of calm wash over me. The 30-minute countdown was ticking away, and Trent had just volunteered to be the first casualty. I slowly pulled away from Trent, stepping out from under his heavy, patronizing arm. I turned to face him fully. I looked at his smug smile, his perfectly styled hair, and the fake confidence radiating from his posture. I finally raised my head and locked eyes with him. The slight, calculated smile returned to my face, and for the very first time since he walked over, Trent's smug expression faltered just a fraction of an inch. Before Trent could attempt to regain his fragile composure, the sharp clicking of stilettos echoed across the marble floor. Chloe, my relentlessly entitled sister-in-law, strutted toward the head table to rescue her husband. She could not stand seeing Trent look even slightly unsure of himself, and she certainly could not stand seeing me maintain my dignity. She swirled the expensive champagne in her crystal glass, a condescending smirk painted across her face as she stepped right into my line of vision. "Do not waste your breath on her, Trent," Chloe announced, ensuring her high-pitched voice carried all the way to the back of the silent ballroom. "You are trying to explain high-level wealth management to a woman whose family considers a successful financial quarter to be finding extra loose change in the sofa cushions. You have to speak a language she actually understands." She turned her venomous gaze entirely on me, looking me up and down as if I were an infectious disease. "Let us talk about your father, Zoe," Chloe said, her tone dripping with pure malice. "Let us talk about good old Elias, a man whose greatest contribution to society is learning how to back up an 18-wheeler without taking out a loading dock." A few scattered chuckles erupted from the tables closest to us. Beverly beamed with absolute pride, thrilled that her daughter was picking up right where she left off. Marcus leaned back against the bar, crossing his arms, and watching the spectacle with a highly amused expression. I kept my face perfectly still, but inside a cold and calculated fire began to burn. Chloe took another step closer, pointing a perfectly manicured finger toward my face. "I remember at your wedding," she continued, projecting her voice to the eager audience. "Your father looked absolutely terrified of the silverware. I honestly thought he was going to ask the waiter for a plastic fork. He reeked of diesel-fueled cheap diner coffee and desperation. We had to ask the venue staff to air out the reception hall after he left. It is honestly embarrassing that my mother even allowed him to stand in our family photos." Every word she spoke was designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. She wanted to rip away my armor by attacking the one person in the world I loved more than anything. "He is a delivery boy, Zoe." Chloe laughed cruelly. "He is a glorified mailman who sleeps in highway rest stops, eats out of vending machines, and showers in public truck stops. That is your bloodline. That is your grand heritage. Grime, sweat, and minimum wage. You think a man who spends 12 hours a day staring at asphalt knows anything about legacy. You think a man with permanent grease under his fingernails understands what it means to build an empire." The profound ignorance of her insults was almost staggering. As she stood there mocking my father for his blue-collar roots, my mind flashed to the reality of who Elias Owens truly was. Yes, my father started with a single rusty truck. He drove through the night hauling freight across state lines to put food on our table. But he did not stop there. What Chloe, Trent, Marcus, and Beverly entirely failed to realize was that my father used the profits from that single truck to buy a second one, then a third, then an entire fleet. While the Harrison family was busy inheriting their money and wasting it on country club memberships and designer clothes, my father was quietly purchasing massive commercial real estate lots for distribution centers. He built Owens Freight from the ground up. He expanded into supply chain logistics, international shipping, and eventually a massive private equity holding firm that specialized in buying out distressed corporate assets. He did not sleep in highway rest stops anymore. He slept in penthouse suites after negotiating billion-dollar acquisitions. While Chloe was learning how to max out her mother's credit cards at luxury boutiques, my father was teaching me how to read complex corporate balance sheets at the kitchen table. He funded the political campaigns of the very politicians sitting in this ballroom. He owned the highways they drove their expensive sports cars on. But I kept my mouth shut. I let Chloe continue her unhinged rant, giving her all the rope she needed to hang herself and her entire family. "You thought marrying my brother would wash that cheap grease off you." Chloe spat, her face flushing red with a sudden vicious anger. "You thought moving into our beautiful estate and wearing the designer clothes my mother generously bought for you would somehow alter your DNA. But underneath that expensive black dress, you are exactly like him. You are nothing but a truck driver's daughter playing dress-up in a world that will never accept you. You are a stray dog we let inside the house, and now you are acting surprised that we are finally kicking you back out onto the street where you belong." The tension in the ballroom reached an absolute breaking point. The verbal abuse directed at my blood family was so vile, so deeply classist, that even a few of the wealthy onlookers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The air felt heavy and suffocating. The entire Harrison family had now publicly declared war, not just on me, but on my father. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Marcus let out a loud, arrogant sigh. "Just sign the damn divorce papers, Zoe," he commanded, clearly bored of the dramatic display. "You heard my sister. You are out of your league. Take the $5,000 a month and go buy your dad a new set of tires." I looked at Marcus. I looked at Chloe, whose chest was heaving with the effort of her hateful speech. I looked at Beverly, who was practically glowing with dark satisfaction. And finally I looked back at Trent, who had regained a tiny bit of his smug posture now that his wife had stepped in to defend his honor. They had all played their parts perfectly. They had laid all their cards on the table, convinced they held a winning hand. The insults, the public humiliation, the aggressive financial intimidation, it was all a desperate illusion, crafted by a family drowning in their own incompetence. I slowly rolled the heavy Mont Blanc pen between my fingers. The cold metal felt grounding. The 30 minutes my father had promised were ticking down rapidly. It was finally time to stop taking their punches and start throwing my own. I placed the heavy Mont Blanc pen down on the table. It landed right next to the signature line of the divorce agreement, the ink completely untouched. Then I turned my body to fully face Trent. He still had his arm draped heavily over my shoulder, fully expecting me to just sit there and absorb his condescending financial lecture. He thought I was paralyzed by the social pressure of the ballroom. I reached up, grabbed him firmly by the wrist, and shoved his arm off me with a swift and violent motion. "Do not ever put your hands on me again," I said, my voice echoing like the crack of a whip across the silent room. Trent stumbled backward, his polished leather shoes slipping slightly on the slick marble floor. He looked completely shocked, his mouth hanging open slightly. He looked as if a piece of the furniture had just suddenly stood up and slapped him across the face. For a man who built his entire personality around dominating the people he viewed as beneath him, physical rejection was something he simply could not process. Before he could attempt to regain his arrogant posture and fire back with another insult, I kept my eyes locked directly on his left wrist. "It is incredibly bold of you, Trent," I continued, projecting my voice so that every single wealthy investor in the room could hear me perfectly. "It takes a staggering amount of audacity to stand in front of 200 elite guests, lecture me on the intricacies of generational wealth, and do it all while wearing a counterfeit Rolex." A collective gasp swept through the country club. In the world of Atlanta, old money, there was absolutely nothing more unforgivable than wearing fake designer goods. It was the ultimate sign of a desperate fraud. Trent's face instantly drained of all color. He looked like all the blood had suddenly rushed to his feet. He instinctively reached over and covered his left wrist with his right hand. It was a panicked, defensive maneuver that immediately confirmed his guilt to everyone watching. The older gentleman, who had just been nodding along with his financial advice a moment ago, now looked at him with profound disgust. "Yes," I said, taking a slow, predatory step toward him. "That supposedly authentic Rolex Daytona you have been flashing in everyone's face all night is an embarrassing knockoff. The sweeping second hand on a real Daytona glides flawlessly around the dial. Yours ticks. I could hear it ticking while you were leaning over me, pretending to be the financial savior of this family. It is a cheap, pathetic imitation, much like your entire career in finance. Trent opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was completely suffocating under the weight of his own exposed lies. You stand here throwing around words like liquidity, capital gains, and fiduciary duty to impress these people, I said, gesturing broadly to the crowd of wide-eyed socialites. But the truth is, your boutique investment firm is a sinking ship. You use complex jargon to mask the fact that your so-called stock portfolio is entirely imaginary. You are over-leveraged, Trent. You are drowning in terrible investments, and you bought a fake luxury watch to project an image of success that you absolutely do not possess. The silence in the ballroom was completely shattered by frantic whispering. The guests were leaning across their tables, completely captivated by the brutal takedown of the Harrison family's golden son-in-law. Chloe, who had just spent the last 5 minutes screaming insults at me and mocking my father's blue-collar roots, was now staring at her husband in absolute horror. Her entire identity was wrapped up in being married to a wealthy, successful broker. The realization that he was faking his status was breaking her brain. "Trent!" she shrieked, her high-pitched voice cracking with pure panic. "Tell her she is lying. Take your hand away and show me the watch right now. Prove to them that she is just a jealous liar." But Trent could not move. His face had shifted from pale white to a deep, violent shade of crimson. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, ruining his perfectly styled hair. He refused to uncover his wrist, stepping backward away from his wife and away from the blinding glare of the chandeliers. He looked at the exit doors like a trapped animal. The mighty financial bro had been completely dismantled and humiliated in less than 60 seconds. Marcus stood frozen near the bar. He had intended to let Trent do the dirty work of intimidating me into signing the divorce papers, but now his ally had been publicly slaughtered. Marcus nervously adjusted his tie, looking incredibly weak, as he failed to step in and defend his own brother-in-law. Beverly watched her flawless family image disintegrate right before her very eyes. Her daughter was screaming, her son-in-law was exposed as a complete fraud, and her wealthy friends were watching the entire spectacle like it was a cheap reality television show. The narrative she had carefully constructed about kicking out the worthless, uneducated daughter-in-law was rapidly falling apart. She was losing control of the room, and it drove her absolutely insane. "You vindictive little brat," Beverly hissed, storming toward the head table. Her perfectly manicured face was twisted into an ugly, hateful scowl. The veins in her neck were bulging against her heavy diamond necklace. "You think you can come into my country club, eat my food, and humiliate my family in front of my guests? I took you out of the gutter. We gave you a beautiful life you never deserved, and this is how you repay our charity." She looked around frantically, desperate to inflict a wound deep enough to put me back in my place. She needed to shift the attention away from Trent's fake watch and back to my working-class roots. Her wild eyes landed on my cell phone, which was sitting on the white tablecloth right next to my clutch. Before I could even reach out my hand to stop her, Beverly lunged forward like a striking snake and snatched the phone off the table. "You want to talk about frauds?" Beverly screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Let us remind everyone exactly where you come from. Let us hear from the great Elias Owens." She held the phone up in the air triumphantly, her face flushed with a toxic mix of rage and adrenaline. "I am going to call your pathetic truck-driving father right now," Beverly announced to the entire ballroom. "I am going to put him on speaker so every single person in this room can hear the sound of the uneducated trash that created you. I am going to tell him to bring his garbage truck to the front doors of this club and haul you away where you belong. Let us see how confident you act when your filthy past is put on display for the whole world to hear." Beverly swiped her thumb aggressively across the screen of my phone. She did not even care that she was invading my privacy. She only cared about the spectacle she was about to create. She found my father's contact labeled simply as Dad and pressed the green call button. With a theatrical flourish, she tapped the speaker icon and held the device high in the air right next to the microphone on the podium. The first ring echoed through the massive speakers of the Oak Ridge Country Club. Ring. The sound was deafening in the suddenly silent ballroom. Every single guest froze. Waiters stopped mid-step, balancing heavy silver trays of expensive champagne. The string quartet in the corner of the room had completely stopped playing their bows, hovering awkwardly over their instruments. 200 of the most elite, wealthy, and judgmental people in Atlanta were holding their collective breath. They were practically salivating at the thought of hearing my father, the supposed uneducated truck driver, stumble his way through a conversation with the intimidating Beverly Harrison. Beverly rested her free hand on her hip, her bright red manicured fingernails tapping a triumphant rhythm against her expensive silk dress. Tap, tap, tap. She wore a look of absolute victory, convinced that this phone call would be the final nail in my social coffin. She wanted to prove to her wealthy friends that I came from nothing, that my bloodline was worthless, and that I would return to the gutter where she believed I belonged. Ring. The second tone blasted through the room. Marcus crossed his arms over his chest, finally managing to pull his eyes away from Trent and the humiliating counterfeit Rolex situation. He looked at me with a sickeningly smug expression, waiting for my father to answer the phone with some crude, unpolished greeting. Chloe leaned forward in her chair, her eyes wide with malicious anticipation, completely forgetting her own husband's public destruction for just a split second. They were all united in their desperate need to see me broken, eager to watch my father get verbally slaughtered on a live microphone. I stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight, my expression entirely neutral. I did not reach for the phone. I did not beg Beverly to stop. I did not show a single ounce of fear. I just watched her red fingernails tapping against her dress, counting the seconds. What Beverly did not know, what none of them knew, was that my father rarely ever picked up his personal phone on the first ring. He was a man who operated entirely on his own time. He did not rush for anyone. He certainly would not rush for a number he did not immediately recognize, even if it was calling from my device. Ring. The third tone stretched out long and agonizing. The tension in the air was so thick, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the room. A few of the older country club members exchanged nervous glances, suddenly realizing how incredibly inappropriate and unhinged this entire display had become. A country club gala was supposed to be a place of refined elegance, not a stage for public family executions. But nobody dared to intervene. Beverly ruled the social circle with an iron fist, and they were all too afraid of becoming her next target. They chose to be silent accomplices to her cruelty. I looked over at Trent. He was still sweating profusely, clutching his left wrist to hide his fake watch. He looked like a man standing on the gallows, praying that this phone call would somehow distract the crowd long enough to erase the memory of his exposed lies. But I knew better. The 30-minute timer was still ticking, and the avalanche had only just begun. Beverly let out an exaggerated sigh, rolling her eyes dramatically for the audience. "Oh, I suppose the manual labor has completely exhausted him," she announced loudly into the microphone, her voice dripping with venomous sarcasm. "Or perhaps he is currently trapped under a greasy engine block and cannot reach his phone. Let us give the poor working-class man a few more seconds to wipe the motor oil off his hands." Laughter rippled through the front row of VIP tables led aggressively by Chloe and Marcus. It was an ugly, deeply classist sound. They were mocking a man they had never truly bothered to know, a man whose relentless work ethic and towering intelligence absolutely dwarfed their entire family combined. Ring. The fourth tone sounded sharp and demanding. I closed my eyes for a brief second, picturing my father. I imagined him sitting in his custom-built mahogany office overlooking the Atlanta skyline, dressed in a bespoke Italian suit. I imagined him reviewing international shipping contracts that were worth more than the entire combined net worth of every person sitting in this ballroom. I imagined the slight calculated frown on his face as he looked down at the caller ID, recognizing my number and slowly reaching out to answer it with the calm, measured authority he commanded in every single aspect of his life. Beverly tapped her foot impatiently, the sharp heel of her designer shoe clicking loudly against the marble floor of the stage. "Pick up the phone, you pathetic old man," she muttered under her breath, just loud enough for the highly sensitive microphone to catch it and broadcast it to the room. "I want them to hear you." The entire ballroom was suspended in a state of suffocating anticipation. They expected a confused, bumbling laborer who would grovel and apologize to the wealthy Harrison matriarch. They expected a man who would be instantly intimidated by the country club setting and the elite crowd listening in on the line. They wanted a caricature of poverty to laugh at. Then right in the middle of the fifth ring, the line clicked open. The abrupt silence that followed was heavy, sudden, and profound. There was no background noise of a busy highway. There was no loud diesel engine roaring in the distance. There was no chaotic diner chatter. There was only crisp, clear, absolute silence from the other end of the line vibrating with an unseen power. Beverly's eyes lit up with malicious joy. She gripped my phone tighter, practically vibrating with the thrill of her impending victory. She leaned directly into the podium microphone, ready to unleash a barrage of insults that she believed would destroy my family name once and for all. Hello, Beverly practically sang into the device, her tone laced with pure, unfiltered poison. Is this Elias Owens, the garbage hauler? I have a very important message for you regarding your worthless daughter. She paused, waiting for my father to take the bait. She waited for him to sound confused, angry, or defensive. The 200 guests held their breath, leaning forward in their seats, their eyes darting rapidly between my calm face and the phone in Beverly's hand. The trap was fully sprung, and Beverly was completely ready to drop the guillotine. Beverly gripped the microphone so hard her hands shook. She leaned forward, her eyes wide with a manic energy, completely intoxicated by the power she thought she wielded over my family. Yes, this is Beverly Harrison, she announced, her voice booming through the massive speakers and bouncing off the crystal chandeliers. I am calling to tell you that your grand experiment has officially failed. Your daughter is a defective product, and the Harrison family is returning her to the manufacturer. The silence on the line remained absolute. There was no gasp of shock. There was no angry outburst. There was not even the sound of a sharp intake of breath. Beverly took that silence as a sign of weakness. She assumed my father was simply too stunned by her wealth and status to speak. She smiled fiercely, exposing her perfectly bleached teeth, and leaned even closer to the microphone. I want you to listen to me very carefully, Elias. Beverly continued, her tone shifting from sarcastic to brutally commanding. I want you to go outside, get into whatever smelly, rusted-out garbage truck you use to haul your pathetic loads, and drive it straight to the Oak Ridge Country Club. Do not bother coming to the front entrance. Use the service doors in the back where the kitchen staff takes out the trash. That is where you will find your daughter. We are officially kicking her out of our family, out of our estate, and out of our lives. Come pick up your burden before I have my security team throw her onto the pavement. Still, the line was completely dead. The utter lack of a response was beginning to create a heavy, suffocating atmosphere in the ballroom. If my father had yelled, if he had cursed at her or defended my honor, Beverly would have had something to push back against. She would have had a fight she could win with her sharp tongue and her microphone. But the total eerie silence from the other end of the phone was creating a deep psychological void. It was like she was screaming into a black hole. The wealthy guests in the room began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. They were used to witnessing polite, passive-aggressive arguments over tennis matches and charity boards. They were not used to seeing the matriarch of the Harrison family foaming at the mouth, publicly degrading a man who was not even defending himself. It made Beverly look unhinged. It made her look desperate. Are you listening to me, you old fool? Beverly shouted, her voice shrill and echoing unpleasantly through the sound system. She tapped the screen of the phone, thinking the connection might have dropped. But the call timer was still ticking upward. He was there. He was just refusing to give her the reaction she so desperately craved. Since you are too cowardly to speak, I will do the talking for both of us. Beverly snarled, completely abandoning any remaining shred of country club etiquette. You and your daughter thought you had won the lottery when she tricked my Marcus into marrying her. You thought you could mix your filthy working-class bloodline with ours. You thought you could wash the grease and the dirt off your hands and pretend to be part of the aristocracy. But people like you do not belong in our world, Elias. You never will. Your entire bloodline is built on sweat, dirt, and minimum wage. You exist to pave the roads we drive on. You exist to carry the boxes we order. You are the help, and the help does not get a seat at the dining table. Every single word she spat was a vicious, calculated attempt to destroy my family's dignity. She wanted to reduce my father's entire existence to nothing more than a crude stereotype. She wanted everyone in that room to view him as a pathetic, uneducated laborer who was entirely beneath their notice. I stood a few feet away, my face completely expressionless. I watched the veins pop out on Beverly's neck. I watched Marcus looking incredibly proud of his mother for fighting his battles. I watched Chloe smiling with pure, malicious joy. They were all so blinded by their own arrogance that they could not see the massive shadow looming over them. They did not realize that the man they were insulting owned the very roads they drove their luxury cars on. They did not realize that the man they were calling the help could buy their entire bloodline with a single phone call and still have enough money left over to buy the country club we were standing in. "Take the $5,000 alimony check we threw at your daughter Beverly," mocked her voice, dripping with fake pity. "Consider it an act of profound charity from the Harrison family. Take the money, buy yourself a new set of tires for your truck, and never show your faces in our city again." She paused, breathing heavily into the microphone. She waited for the devastating impact of her words to finally break him. She waited for him to beg for a second chance, or to ask for more money, or to break down crying over the humiliation of his daughter. But the silence stretched on. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. The audio feedback of the dead air amplified through the speakers, emitting a low, haunting hum. The tension in the room was so thick it was almost unbearable. The string quartet members were staring at the floor, looking completely horrified. The club manager stood by the doors, his face an unreadable mask, simply waiting for the inevitable explosion. Beverly's facade began to crack. Her triumphant smile faltered, replaced by a look of deep, unsettling confusion. She looked at the phone in her hand, then looked up at me. She expected me to be in tears, devastated by the brutal verbal assault on my father. Instead, I was just looking at her with a calm, almost pitying expression. "I said, come get your trash, Elias!" Beverly screamed, losing complete control of her volume. Her voice distorted through the microphone, sounding harsh and ugly. "Answer me." She was unraveling. The psychological warfare of my father's silence was breaking her down from the inside out. She needed him to acknowledge her power. She needed him to validate her superiority. By refusing to speak, my father was denying her the one thing she wanted most, and it was driving her absolutely insane. "Do you hear me?" she shrieked, gripping the podium with her free hand. "Do you understand who you are dealing with?" The silence held for exactly 3 more seconds, and then finally the deep, resonant voice of my father echoed through the silent ballroom, completely devoid of anger, entirely unfazed by her hysterical screaming, and carrying the weight of a man who held the fate of their entire family in the palm of his hand. "I hear you, Beverly," my father said. His voice was not raised. It was a smooth, deep baritone that vibrated through the massive speakers, carrying an undeniable authority that instantly commanded the attention of every single person in the ballroom. There was no trace of the uneducated laborer she had been screaming at for the past 2 minutes. There was no fear, no intimidation, and absolutely no anger. It was the voice of a man who was entirely used to giving orders, not taking them. The wealthy guests exchanged confused, nervous glances. This did not fit the narrative Beverly had just spent the entire evening constructing. A man who hauled trash for minimum wage did not speak with that level of terrifying composure. Beverly gripped the podium, her knuckles turning completely white. She opened her mouth to unleash another wave of insults, desperate to regain the upper hand. But my father did not let her speak. He cut her off with a calm precision that was far more devastating than any shouted insult could ever be. "I taught my daughter patience," my father said, the steady cadence of his words slicing right through the heavy tension in the room. "I taught her to sit quietly and let arrogant people reveal exactly who they are before she makes her move. You have done a spectacular job of that tonight, Beverly." Beverly looked completely taken aback. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land. She looked frantically out at her wealthy friends, desperately trying to read their reactions. They were no longer laughing, they were staring at the phone with morbid fascination, completely captivated by the sudden shift in power. I will give you exactly 30 more minutes to enjoy that glass of champagne. Beverly, my father continued, his tone dropping an octave, sending a literal chill through the ballroom. I highly suggest you savor every single drop of it, because I am already in the parking lot. The line went dead. My father hung up on her. He did not wait for a response. He did not care what she had to say next. He had delivered his verdict and the conversation was over. A sharp dial tone echoed through the speakers, buzzing loudly for several seconds before Beverly finally fumbled to press the end button. The silence that followed was absolute. The string quartet was completely frozen. The waiters stood perfectly still like statues holding their silver trays. The air in the room felt 20 degrees colder. Beverly stared at the phone in her hand as if it had just bitten her. Her perfectly constructed reality was beginning to fracture, but her massive ego refused to let her acknowledge it. She could not process the idea that a man she considered to be absolute trash had just spoken to her with the icy authority of a billionaire corporate executive. Her brain simply rejected the information. She forced a loud, shrill laugh that sounded incredibly unnatural in the quiet room. She looked out at the sea of elite guests, plastering on a fake wide smile that did not reach her panicked eyes. "Well," Beverly announced, her voice shaking slightly as she tried to project confidence. "It sounds like the manual labor has finally fried the poor old man's brain. He is probably sitting in his rusted-out garbage truck by the dumpsters right now, trying to figure out how to put it in park." She looked over at Marcus, silently begging him to back her up. Marcus quickly grabbed a fresh glass of champagne from a nearby table and raised it in the air, offering a weak, nervous chuckle. To the working class, Marcus toasted loudly, trying desperately to lighten the suffocating mood. May they always remember to use the service entrance. A few of their closest friends offered polite, strained laughter, but the majority of the room remained completely silent. The energy had shifted drastically. The elite socialites of Atlanta were predators by nature. They could smell weakness, and right now the Harrison family was reeking of it. Beverly aggressively shoved my phone back across the table. It slid across the white tablecloth and bumped against my water glass. "Take your phone, Zoe!" She snapped, her face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and lingering rage. "And pack whatever cheap clothes you brought into this marriage. When that 30 minutes is up, I want you and your delusional father off my property for good." She turned on her heel and marched away from the stage, signaling frantically for the orchestra to start playing again. The musicians hastily picked up their instruments, launching into a fast, upbeat classical piece that completely clashed with the dark, heavy mood of the room. The party resumed, but it was nothing more than a hollow performance. Guests grouped together in tight circles, whispering furiously behind their hands. Their eyes darted constantly between Beverly, who was aggressively downing a glass of wine, and me, still standing calmly by the head table. Trent had retreated to a dark corner near the bar, keeping his left arm pinned firmly behind his back, looking like a man waiting for an execution squad. Chloe was hovering next to him, her face pale, completely stripped of her previous arrogance. Marcus walked over to a group of his wealthy clinic investors, trying to boast about his upcoming engagement to the senator's daughter. But the investors were looking at him differently now. The red medical file I had thrown at his chest was still lying open on the table, the state seal glaring at anyone who walked past. They were starting to connect the dots. They were starting to realize that the Golden Boy surgeon had not picked up a scalpel in half a year. I picked up my phone and slipped it quietly back into my clutch. I did not move toward the exit. I did not pack my things. I simply picked up my glass of red wine, took a slow, deliberate sip, and looked at my watch. The countdown had officially begun. Beverly thought my father was bluffing. She truly believed he was just a desperate poor man making empty threats to protect his pride. She thought the 30 minutes was just an arbitrary number he threw out to sound intimidating before he quietly drove away in shame. She had no idea that my father never bluffed. He was a man who calculated every single move with lethal precision. When he said 30 minutes, it was not a threat. It was a perfectly timed schedule. I watched Beverly force another laugh at something a country club board member said. She was clinging so desperately to her illusion of power, completely unaware that the ground beneath her expensive designer shoes had already crumbled. She was still acting like the queen of the castle, completely oblivious to the fact that the bank had finalized the paperwork yesterday. The asset transfers were entirely complete. The Harrison family did not own this country club anymore. They did not own their pristine medical clinic. They did not even own the massive ancestral estate they were currently sleeping in. They were completely bankrupt, holding onto a lifestyle funded entirely by a massive shell game of debt that my father had just quietly bought out from under them. The ticking of the clock felt almost physical. Minute by minute, the final 30 minutes of their reign was slipping away. I stood alone at the table, surrounded by the hostile stares of the people who thought they had just ruined my life, and I smiled. The trap had fully snapped shut, and now all I had to do was watch them realize they were caught. 5 minutes had passed since my father hung up the phone. The orchestra was still attempting to play an upbeat classical piece, but the musicians looked terrified, and the notes sounded completely hollow. Beverly was stationed by the massive mahogany bar, aggressively commanding the bartenders to pour her more champagne. She was desperately trying to force a celebratory mood that had entirely died, laughing too loudly at jokes nobody was making. I remained standing at the head table, the untouched divorce agreement sitting right next to my hand. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my red wine, letting the robust flavor wash over my tongue. I kept my eyes locked on Trent. He was huddled in the darkest corner of the ballroom, his back pressed firmly against the silk wallpaper. He looked like a man waiting for the floor to open up and swallow him whole. He was still clutching his left wrist, trying to hide the counterfeit watch, sweating profusely into the collar of his expensive Italian shirt. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing ringtone shattered the manufactured peace of the room. It was not a polite, subtle vibration. It was a loud, obnoxious alarm-style ringtone coming directly from Trent's tailored jacket pocket. He flinched violently, as if he had just been physically struck. He reached into his coat with trembling fingers and pulled out his phone. I watched from across the room as he stared at the glowing screen. His eyes widened to the size of saucers. The last remaining drops of color vanished from his face, leaving him looking like a polished corpse. He did not want to answer it, but the phone just kept ringing, echoing loudly, and drawing the stares of every wealthy guest around him. I placed my wine glass down on the table. The soft clink barely registered over the murmurs of the crowd. I smoothed the front of my black gown and began to walk slowly toward him. The crowd naturally parted for me, stepping aside as if I were royalty, their eyes darting rapidly back and forth between my calm expression and the terrified finance broker. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from him, close enough to see the sheer terror vibrating in his pupils. "Answer it, Trent," I said smoothly, my voice easily carrying over the nervous whispers of the elite audience. "It is incredibly rude to ignore the Securities and Exchange Commission on such a festive night." Trent froze completely. He looked at me in absolute horror, his mouth opening and closing silently like a fish out of water. Chloe, who had been hovering nervously beside him since his watch was exposed, grabbed his arm. Her manicured nails dug deeply into his expensive sleeve. "What is she talking about?" "Trent?" Chloe demanded, her high-pitched voice cracking with sudden panic. "Who is calling you right now?" He slowly swiped the screen with a shaking thumb and brought the phone to his ear. He did not say a single word. He just listened. I did not need to hear the voice on the other end of the line to know exactly what they were saying to him. I knew the exact script. I knew the exact federal statutes they were currently reading to him because I was the one who had provided them with the evidence. I took another step closer, invading his personal space, just like he had done to me earlier at the table. "Let me save you the trouble of translating all that complex financial jargon, Trent," I said, ensuring my voice projected clearly to the VIP tables surrounding us. "The SEC is calling to inform you that your boutique investment firm is officially under federal investigation for severe securities fraud and wire fraud. As of exactly 2 minutes ago, every single bank account associated with your name, your firm, and your wife has been completely frozen by the federal government." Trent's knees began to visibly buckle. He leaned heavily against the wall to keep himself from collapsing onto the marble floor. You see, I continued pacing slowly in front of him like a predator circling wounded prey. When you stood up there earlier and lectured me about asset management and fiduciary duty, you made one massive miscalculation. You assumed that because I was quiet, I was blind. You assumed I did not notice when you convinced Beverly to give you full access to the Harrison family cash reserves. You told her you were going to aggressively grow the family portfolio to prepare for Marcus and his new fiancée. But that is not what you did at all, is it? Chloe let go of his arm, taking a slow step backward. Her face was twisted in deep confusion and growing terror. "Trent, what did you do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I turned my gaze to Chloe, offering her a cold, empty smile. "Your brilliant husband did not invest your family money, Chloe. He embezzled it. I am the director of risk management for a private equity firm that manages billions. It took me less than an hour of forensic accounting to track his sloppy digital footprints. He set up a dummy shell company in the Cayman Islands and wired exactly $4 million of your inheritance out of the country. And then, because he possesses the financial intelligence of a desperate, addicted gambler, he threw every single penny of it into a series of highly volatile, absolutely worthless cryptocurrency schemes. And he lost it. He lost it all. Every last cent is completely gone. I sent the comprehensive audit files to the SEC this morning, I added, turning back to Trent. They have everything. The wire transfers, the fake ledgers, and the encrypted emails. The phone slipped from Trent's sweaty fingers. It hit the marble floor with a loud crack, the screen shattering into a spider web of broken glass. The voice of the federal agent could still be heard faintly buzzing from the damaged speaker, demanding that Trent acknowledge the charges. But Trent could not speak. The crushing reality of federal prison, combined with the total loss of his stolen fortune and the absolute destruction of his fake social status, completely broke his mind. He let out a strange, choked sob. His legs gave out completely, and he collapsed onto his knees, right in the middle of the ballroom, his custom Italian suit pooling around him on the floor. He buried his face in his hands and began to weep uncontrollably. The silence that followed was absolute. The orchestra finally stopped playing. Beverly stood frozen at the mahogany bar, a half-empty glass of champagne slipping from her hand and shattering on the ground. She stared at Trent, her mind slowly processing the fact that her entire liquid fortune had just been incinerated by her favorite son-in-law. Then a sound erupted from Chloe that did not even sound human. It was a guttural, primal scream of pure rage and total devastation. Her entire identity, her wealth, her status, her ability to look down on working-class people like me, it had all just vanished into thin air. "You stole my money!" Chloe shrieked, launching herself at her husband like a wild animal. She tackled him to the hard marble floor, her perfectly manicured hands turning into violent claws. She slapped him across the face, tearing at his hair and ripping the collar of his shirt. "You ruined my life, you pathetic loser. Give me my money back. Give it back to me right now." Trent just lay there on his back, staring blankly at the crystal chandelier above him, letting his wife beat his chest while the elite guests of the Oak Ridge Country Club watched in absolute horror. People were stepping backward, holding their hands over their mouths in shock. Two of the waiters had to rush forward and physically drag Chloe off of him as she kicked and screamed obscenities that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. I stood above them, watching the glorious chaos unfold. The golden couple of the Harrison family was publicly bleeding out on the floor. I turned my back on them and walked calmly back to my table. I picked up my glass of wine and took another slow, deeply satisfying sip. One down, I thought to myself, feeling the power shift entirely into my hands. And there were still 25 minutes left on the clock. Exactly 10 minutes had passed since my father hung up the phone. We were officially at the 15-minute mark of the countdown, and the grand anniversary gala had fully transformed into a crime scene of social destruction. The whispers among the 200 elite guests were no longer subtle or hidden behind silk napkins. They were loud, pointed, and filled with delicious scandal. The wealthy socialites of Atlanta were predators by nature, and they could smell the blood in the water. People were pulling out their cell phones not to call for help, but to record the spectacular downfall of the city's most arrogant family. The manufactured peace of the Oak Ridge Country Club was completely shattered by the sound of Trent quietly sobbing on the floor and Chloe screaming obscenities at the ceiling. Beverly was hyperventilating. She leaned heavily against the mahogany bar, gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles were completely white. She watched the federal destruction of her favorite son-in-law with wide, unblinking eyes. She could not comprehend how her perfect night a night she had meticulously planned to destroy my life had spiraled into a nightmare so quickly. The country club manager was nervously pacing near the grand entrance, speaking frantically into his radio, clearly debating whether to call the local authorities to deal with Chloe's violent outburst. The string quartet had completely packed up their instruments and fled the stage, refusing to provide a soundtrack for a federal fraud scandal. In Beverly's twisted, narcissistic mind, this catastrophic failure could not possibly be the fault of her own greedy family. She was incapable of taking responsibility. She needed a scapegoat. She needed someone to absorb the crushing weight of this public humiliation before her wealthy friends realized she was completely broke. Her manic, bloodshot eyes darted across the ruined ballroom and locked directly onto me. I was standing calmly by the head table, completely untouched by the chaos, holding my glass of wine. I did not look away when she glared at me. I offered her a slow, knowing smile that pushed her right over the edge of sanity. Beverly marched toward the center of the room, her designer heels crunching over the broken glass of Trent's shattered cell phone. She pointed a shaking, accusatory finger directly at my face. "This is your doing," Beverly screamed, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "You brought this curse into my house. You set him up. You are a disgusting, manipulative little viper, and you are trying to destroy us because you are jealous of our success." I did not move an inch. I just looked at her with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. "I did not force Trent to steal your money, Beverly," I replied smoothly, my voice easily cutting through the noise of the panicking crowd. "I did not force him to gamble away your entire liquid fortune on fake internet currency. I merely turned on the lights so everyone in this room could see the rats scattering in your kitchen." Beverly let out a frustrated primal shriek. She spun around to face Marcus. My husband was standing frozen near the melting ice sculpture, looking completely shell-shocked by the rapid, brutal collapse of his family's wealth. He looked small, weak, and entirely pathetic. "Marcus," Beverly commanded, her voice turning deeply lethal as she pointed at me again, "get this trash out of my sight right now. Do not wait for the country club security to do it. Grab her by the hair if you have to, and throw her out the front doors. I want her gone. I want her completely erased from this building before I lose my mind." Marcus blinked slowly, snapping out of his panicked trance. He had been looking for a way to assert his dominance all night. He had stood quietly while his mother insulted my family. He had hidden like a coward behind Trent's fake financial lectures. But now Trent was weeping on the floor like a child, and his mother was demanding action. Marcus needed to prove to his wealthy clinic investors, who were watching his every move very closely, that he was still the powerful alpha male of the Harrison family. He needed to salvage his fragile masculinity. He needed to show the room that he was still in absolute control. He dropped his empty scotch glass onto a nearby cocktail table. The glass tipped over, spilling amber liquid onto the white linen, but he did not care. He cracked his knuckles, a threatening gesture that he probably learned from a movie. His face twisted into an ugly, violent snarl that completely shattered his polished professional doctor persona. "You heard my mother," Marcus growled, taking heavy, aggressive steps toward me. "The party is over, Zoe. You have done enough damage for one night. You ruined my sister's marriage, and now you are trying to ruin my reputation. It is time for you to leave, and I am going to make sure you feel every single step out that door." A few of the older women in the front row gasped loudly, taking a step back to avoid the impending violence. A man in a tuxedo shouted for Marcus to calm down, but nobody actually stepped forward to intervene. They were all too terrified of getting caught in the crossfire of a domestic dispute. Marcus was a tall, athletic man, and the rage burning in his dark eyes was entirely real. He wanted to hurt me. He wanted to physically break me down to compensate for the absolute destruction of his ego. He closed the distance between us with rapid, furious strides. His heavy dress shoes echoed off the marble floor. I stood my ground. I did not cower. I did not step backward. I did not look around the room for a savior, because I did not need one. I knew exactly how cowardly Marcus truly was. He relied heavily on physical intimidation when dealing with women, but he crumbled instantly when faced with actual tangible power. Marcus lunged forward with a loud grunt. He reached out with both of his large hands, his fingers curled into tight claws, aiming directly for my shoulders. He intended to grab the fabric of my dress violently, jerk me forward, and physically drag me across the country club floor in front of the entire city elite. It was a desperate, animalistic move from a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. I did not flinch. I did not step back. As his hands came within inches of my shoulders, I moved with a practiced and calculated speed. I reached into my clutch, pulled out a thick red medical folder, and slammed it squarely into the center of his chest. The heavy thud of the thick paper hitting his sternum stopped his forward momentum instantly. Instinctively, he brought his hands down to catch the file before it hit the floor, entirely abandoning his physical attack. He looked down at the bright red cover, and the violent rage in his eyes instantly morphed into absolute paralyzing fear. "You want to use force, Marcus?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm, but projecting loudly enough to cut through the murmurs of the room. "You want to drag me out of here to prove how strong and powerful you are. Let us talk about the source of that power. Let us talk about your brilliant medical career." I took a step toward him, forcing him to take a step back. I looked out at the sea of wealthy guests, specifically locking eyes with several of the elite socialites who practically lived at the Harrison Plastic Surgery Clinic. "You have all been told tonight that Marcus is a top-tier surgeon," I announced clearly. "You have been told he is the golden boy of Atlanta medicine. But I highly suggest you open that folder, Marcus. Show your loyal investors the official letter from the State Medical Board. Show them the bright red seal at the bottom of the page that confirms your medical license was completely revoked 6 months ago." A collective gasp erupted from the front tables. The silence was immediately broken by a wave of furious whispering. Several older women whose faces were heavily bandaged just weeks ago by Marcus stood up from their chairs in utter horror. Marcus shook his head frantically, his polished exterior completely disintegrating. He tried to shove the folder back at me, but I refused to take it. It slipped from his trembling hands and fell open onto the white tablecloth. The official state document spilled out for everyone in the front row to see. "You completely botched a complex facial reconstruction." I continued my words, hitting him like physical blows. "You permanently disfigured a patient, and then you arrogantly attempted to illegally falsify their medical records to cover up your gross negligence. You are not a world-class surgeon, Marcus. You are a massive liability who has not been legally allowed to hold a scalpel since last October." Absolute chaos erupted. An older gentleman in a tuxedo, one of the primary financial investors for the Harrison Clinic, slammed his fist hard on his table. He demanded to know if this was true. Women began shouting in outrage, checking their own faces in their compact mirrors, screaming about immediate lawsuits and police involvement. The pristine, untouchable image of the Harrison Clinic was burning to the ground right before their very eyes. The golden child was entirely exposed as a dangerous fraud. Marcus looked around frantically, realizing he was suddenly surrounded by furious clients. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "She is lying," he yelled over the rising noise, his voice cracking with desperation. "She printed those fake documents out to ruin me because she is bitter. I am marrying the daughter of a United States senator." "Do you really think a senator would let his daughter marry a fraud? I pay for her lavish lifestyle. I pay for this entire party. I am Marcus Harrison, and I have millions." I actually laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound that sliced right through his pathetic, crumbling defense. "You pay for absolutely nothing, Marcus," I corrected him, reaching back into my clutch and pulling out a sleek black metal credit card. I held it high up to the chandelier light so everyone could see it. You see, I explained to the captivated audience, when Marcus lost his license, his income vanished entirely, but he still needed to play the role of the rich bachelor to woo his new politician fiancée. He needed to buy her expensive dinner's designer bags and that massive diamond engagement ring. So he did what he always does. He leeched off someone else. I tossed the metal card onto the table right next to the damning medical records. It landed with a heavy metallic clink. He used this black corporate credit card, I continued. The exact same card Beverly has been flaunting around town for months to fund her country club lunches and this very gala. The card they firmly believed was tied to a hidden Harrison family trust account. But if you look very closely at the name engraved on the bottom left corner, Marcus, you will realize one tiny crucial detail. Marcus stared down at the card. His breath caught sharply in his throat. His entire body began to tremble. That account belongs to Owen's Freight, I said softly, stepping in so close he had no choice but to hear every single syllable. I am the primary guarantor. My uneducated truck-driving father authorized it. Which means every single luxury you have enjoyed for the past 6 months, including the ring you bought your mistress, was funded entirely by the blue-collar family you just spent the last hour publicly humiliating. And I canceled that card exactly 20 minutes ago. Marcus looked like the oxygen had been violently sucked out of his lungs. He could not form a single word. He stumbled backward, his polished leather shoes slipping on the floor. He bumped hard into a cocktail table, knocking over a massive tower of champagne glasses. The loud cascading crash of the breaking crystal perfectly mirrored the total destruction of his ego. The golden boy of the Harrison family was now nothing more than an unemployed, broke, and legally disgraced fraud. Beverly could not comprehend the rapid, brutal collapse of her son's reputation. The golden boy surgeon, the man whose career she had practically weaponized to elevate her own social standing, was now a disgraced fraud. The elite guests who had just been treating the Harrison family like royalty were now demanding answers, shouting about lawsuits and medical negligence. The party had descended into an absolute nightmare, and Beverly realized that she had entirely lost control of the narrative. Her carefully constructed reality was burning to the ground, and I was holding the match. She needed to eliminate the threat. She needed to remove me from the room immediately before I could expose any more of their devastating secrets. Her manicured hands were shaking violently as she frantically searched the ballroom for anyone to restore her illusion of power. Her wild, bloodshot eyes finally locked onto the grand entrance doors. "Security!" Beverly shrieked, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated hysteria. Her shout echoed unpleasantly off the vaulted ceilings, silencing the angry murmurs of the wealthy clients for just a moment. "Security! Get in here right now!" The heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open. Charles, the stern-looking club manager in a flawless, tailored suit, stepped into the room. He was a man who had tolerated Beverly's arrogant demands for years because she was a high-paying member. Flanking him were 4 large, incredibly intimidating security guards dressed in sharp black uniforms. Beverly let out a massive, dramatic sigh of relief. She pointed a trembling finger directly at me, her face flushed with a toxic mix of rage and adrenaline. "Throw her out," she ordered Charles, her voice dripping with the entitled arrogance she was so famous for. "She is causing a massive disturbance. She is insulting my family and spreading vicious lies to my guests. I want her dragged out of this club and thrown onto the street immediately. Do not be gentle. She is a trespasser." She turned back to the crowd, forcing a strained, pathetic smile, trying to act as though she had successfully handled a minor inconvenience. "Do not worry, everyone," Beverly announced loudly. "The trash is finally being taken out. We apologize for this horrific display of lower-class behavior." She waited for the satisfying sound of the security guards grabbing me. She waited to see me struggle and scream as I was forcibly removed from her presence. She waited for the ultimate victory she believed she deserved. But Charles did not move toward me with anger. The security guards did not reach for their radios or their handcuffs. They did not even look at Beverly. Charles walked straight past Beverly, completely ignoring her hysterical demands. He walked past Marcus, who was still staring blankly at the ruined medical files and the black corporate credit card on the table. The manager stopped directly in front of me. He stood up straight, adjusted his suit jacket, and bowed his head slightly in a deep, undeniable show of respect. The four massive security guards immediately stepped up and formed a protective wall right behind me, their arms crossed over their chests, glaring intimidatingly at Marcus and Beverly. Miss Owens, Charles said respectfully, his voice carrying just enough weight to cut through the stunned silence of the crowd. "Is this woman bothering you? We can have her escorted off your property immediately if you wish. We have a car waiting out front for you whenever you are ready to leave." Beverly stopped breathing entirely. Her eyes bulged out of her head so far they looked like they might pop. The entire room seemed to tilt violently on its axis. "My property!" Beverly choked out her voice, barely a whisper. She looked back and forth between me and the manager, her brain completely unable to process the words she had just heard. It was as if Charles had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. The elite guests in the front row exchanged horrified, deeply confused glances. The matriarch of the Harrison family had just been completely dismissed by the staff she believed she owned. I smiled warmly at the manager, enjoying the sheer terror washing over my mother-in-law's face. "Thank you, Charles, but that will not be necessary just yet. I want them to hear the rest of the story first. I have a few more minutes left on my schedule." I turned my attention back to Beverly. She was hyperventilating, gripping the podium for dear life. "You really should read the fine print before you try to ruin someone's life, Beverly," I said softly, stepping closer to her. "Because you just tried to kick me out of my own building." I watched Beverly's manicured hands tremble as she gripped the wooden podium. The sheer terror in her eyes was exquisite. She looked like a queen who had just realized her castle was built on quicksand. I slowly walked over to the table where the pristine divorce agreement was still lying completely untouched by my pen. I picked it up, feeling the heavy, expensive paper between my fingers. I flipped to the second page, scanning the text until I found the exact clause I was looking for. "This is a fascinating document, Beverly," I said, projecting my voice clearly. "You really went out of your way to ensure I would walk away with absolutely nothing. You listed the country club membership, the clinic assets, the ancestral estate, and even Marcus's luxury cars as protected family wealth. You wanted to make sure the poor, uneducated truck driver's daughter could not touch a single dime of your empire." I looked up from the paper and locked eyes with her. "The problem with your strategy, Beverly, is that you cannot protect assets you no longer own." A confused murmur rippled through the ballroom. The wealthy guests exchanged bewildered glances. Marcus stepped forward, his face pale and slick with sweat. "What are you talking about, Zoe?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "We own all of it. My great-grandfather built that estate. We have owned it for a century." I smiled, a slow, predatory curve of my lips. "You did own it, Marcus," I corrected him gently, past tense. "But then your brilliant brother-in-law, Trent, started hemorrhaging money in the cryptocurrency market. He panicked. He came to your mother and begged for access to the family reserves. And Beverly, desperate to maintain the illusion of endless wealth and protect her favorite son-in-law's reputation, agreed to help him." I turned my gaze back to Beverly. She was hyperventilating now, taking short, jagged breaths. But the family reserves were not enough to cover his massive losses, were they? "Beverly," I continued, my voice echoing through the silent room. "So you made a desperate, incredibly reckless decision. Without telling Marcus, without telling your wealthy investors, and certainly without telling the country club board, you quietly took out massive secondary mortgages on everything. You leveraged the ancestral estate. You leveraged the medical clinic. You even leveraged the collateral on this very country club membership. You thought Trent would quickly double the money and you could pay it all back before anyone noticed." Trent let out a loud, pathetic sob from his place on the floor, confirming everything I was saying. Chloe kicked him hard in the ribs, but he did not even try to defend himself. "But Trent did not double the money," I said, my tone turning sharp and unforgiving. "He lost it. He lost every single penny. And suddenly, the great Harrison family was completely incapable of making their monthly mortgage payments. You defaulted on the loans, Beverly. You defaulted on all of them. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. The city's elite were staring at Beverly with a mixture of shock and deep disgust. In their world, going bankrupt was bad, but trying to hide it and pretend you were still wealthy was an unforgivable social sin. When a bank holds a massive amount of defaulted loans, I explained, dropping the financial jargon for the benefit of the terrified family, they do not always go through the long, messy process of foreclosure. Instead, they bundle those bad loans together. They call them non-performing loans, or NPLs. And they sell that bundle of debt to private equity firms for a fraction of the cost just to get it off their books. I held up the divorce agreement, waving it slightly in the air. The bank sold your debt, Beverly. They sold the mortgage to your house, the lien on your clinic, and the collateral on your cars. They bundled up your entire fake aristocratic life and auctioned it off to the highest bidder. Beverly looked like she was going to be sick. Her face was entirely drained of color. She stumbled backward, bumping into the wall behind the podium. Who? She choked out, her voice barely a desperate whisper. Who bought it? That is the truly beautiful part of this entire situation. I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. You spent this entire evening publicly humiliating me. You insulted my father. You called my family trash. You stood on this stage and demanded that I take a $5,000 pity allowance and return to the gutter. You were so incredibly confident in your superiority, but you were too busy looking down your nose at me to see the bulldozer coming straight for your front door. I slowly tore the divorce agreement perfectly in half. The sound of the thick paper ripping echoed loudly in the quiet room. I dropped the pieces onto the floor, right into a puddle of spilled champagne. I do not need your pity allowance, Marcus, I said, looking at my soon-to-be ex-husband. And I certainly do not need to sign a document protecting assets that belong to a bank. Because as of yesterday afternoon, the Harrison family is officially, completely, and legally bankrupt. You own absolutely nothing. The reality of their situation finally crashed down on them. Chloe stopped screaming at Trent and stared at me in horrified silence. Marcus slumped against the bar, burying his face in his hands. Beverly was clutching her chest, gasping for air, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. They were ruined. Their wealth, their status, their entire identity had evaporated into thin air. But Beverly still did not understand the final piece of the puzzle. She looked up at me, her eyes wild with panic and confusion. If the bank sold our debt, she whispered frantically, then who owns it? Who are we in debt to? Before I could answer her, a deep, powerful sound echoed from outside the country club. It was the synchronized screech of heavy tires slamming onto the pristine cobblestone driveway. The sound was so loud it rattled the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the ballroom. The 30-minute countdown had officially hit 0. My father was no longer in the parking lot, he was at the front door. Every single head in the ballroom snapped toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows facing the main entrance. The bright glare of high-beam headlights cut violently through the darkness outside, illuminating the grand cobblestone driveway of the country club. Beverly had spent the entire evening loudly predicting the arrival of a rusty, foul-smelling garbage truck. She had painted a vivid, humiliating picture of a broken-down laborer coming to collect his trash from the service entrance. But the vehicles that had just forcefully stopped in front of the Oak Ridge Country Club were anything but trash. 3 massive black armored SUVs flanked a pristine, gleaming Maybach. The vehicles were spotless, radiating a terrifying level of corporate and physical power. They looked like a presidential motorcade, completely dwarfing the expensive sports cars and luxury sedans parked nearby. The heavy engines purred with a low, menacing rumble that vibrated through the glass panes of the ballroom. The wealthy socialites pressed themselves against the windows, their champagne glasses completely forgotten. The furious whispers and angry shouts from moments ago died out instantly, replaced by a suffocating collective dread. They stared at the vehicles in absolute awe. In the world of Atlanta, old money true power was recognized immediately, and the power radiating from that driveway was entirely undeniable. Beverly stumbled forward, her hands pressing against the cold window pane. Her breath fogged the glass. She blinked rapidly, her brain entirely failing to process the sight in front of her. "That cannot be him," she whispered, her voice shaking violently. "That is a mistake. Somebody else is arriving, a politician, a celebrity. That cannot possibly be Elias." As if responding directly to her denial, the heavy doors of the 3 armored SUVs swung open in perfect synchronization. Large men in sharp, tailored black suits stepped out into the crisp night air. They moved with terrifying military precision, fanning out to instantly secure the perimeter of the driveway. But it was the men who stepped out of the lead vehicle that sent a shockwave of pure terror through the ballroom. They were not wearing business suits. They were wearing heavy tactical vests with bright yellow lettering stamped boldly across their chests. United States Marshals. The federal agents stood tall, their silver badges catching the light of the crystal chandeliers spilling out from the windows. They possessed the kind of unquestionable legal authority that even the wealthiest people in Atlanta feared. They were not here to attend a party. They were not here to negotiate. They were here to execute federal court orders with absolute, uncompromising force. Marcus backed away from the window, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. He looked at Trent, who was still weeping uncontrollably on the floor, and then looked back at the armed federal agents standing outside the doors. "Are they here for Trent?" Marcus stammered, his voice cracking with high-pitched panic. "Did they come to arrest Trent for the wire fraud?" I did not bother looking out the window. I kept my eyes entirely on Marcus and Beverly, watching their fake aristocratic world collapse in real time. "The Securities and Exchange Commission handles Trent," Wari said calmly, letting the brutal reality sink into his bones. "The United States Marshals handle property seizures. They are not here for Trent, Marcus. They are here for you. They are here to legally evict you from this building." Beverly let out a sharp, strangled gasp. She gripped the heavy velvet drapes next to the window to keep her legs from completely giving out. Outside, the rear door of the gleaming Maybach finally opened. A driver in a crisp, dark uniform stood at attention and held the door wide. The entire ballroom held its breath as a single polished shoe stepped out onto the cobblestone. It was not a scuffed work boot. It was not covered in grease or highway mud. It was a bespoke Italian dress shoe that cost more than most people in that room made in an entire month. My father stepped out of the vehicle. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, broad-shouldered, and deeply imposing. He was wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit that radiated pure, unfiltered wealth. He held a silver-tipped walking cane in his right hand, not because he needed it for balance, but because it completed the aesthetic of a man who owned absolutely everything he looked at. He did not look like a tired truck driver arriving to beg for his daughter. He looked like a ruthless corporate emperor arriving to inspect his newly conquered territory. The elite guests inside the ballroom stared in stunned silence. This was the man Beverly had just spent 10 minutes screaming at over a speakerphone. This was the man she had called a garbage hauler and a pathetic loser. They realized in an instant that Beverly Harrison had not just insulted a working-class father. She had deeply and personally offended a hidden billionaire. My father did not look around at the manicured lawns. He did not look at the expensive architecture of the country club. His dark, piercing eyes locked dead ahead, staring straight through the glass doors. He exuded a cold, calculated fury that required absolutely no shouting. The U.S. Marshals immediately fell into step behind him, forming a tight, impenetrable protective formation as he walked slowly and purposefully toward the entrance. Charles, the stern club manager who had just refused Beverly's orders to throw me out, rushed to the front of the room. He bypassed the terrified Harrison family completely and pushed the massive double-glass doors wide open himself, bowing his head respectfully as the cool night air swept into the stiflingly hot ballroom. The heavy rhythmic sound of my father's silver-tipped cane tapping against the marble floor echoed through the silent space, sounding exactly like the ticking of a clock that had just run out of time. The sound of the cane against the marble floor was methodical and completely unhurried. Every step my father took seemed to suck the remaining oxygen right out of the ballroom. As he crossed the threshold, the sea of elite guests instinctively scrambled backward. They parted like the Red Sea, creating a wide, unobstructed path directly to the head table. These were people who prided themselves on their exclusivity, who believed their generational wealth made them untouchable. But true power has a gravitational pull that cannot be ignored, and my father possessed a gravitational pull that could crush a diamond into dust. He paused for a fraction of a second, surveying the absolute wreckage of the anniversary gala. His dark eyes swept over the shattered champagne glasses, the spilled wine, and the cowering figures of the Harrison family. He did not look angry. He looked profoundly disappointed, like a corporate chief executive officer inspecting a failing warehouse right before he fires the entire management team. He carried himself with a quiet, lethal grace that demanded absolute submission from everyone in his presence. Beverly was completely paralyzed. She stood frozen against the heavy velvet window drapes, her manicured hands clutching the fabric so tightly her knuckles were translucent. The arrogant matriarch who had spent the entire evening screaming insults into a microphone was suddenly incapable of making a single sound. Her mouth opened, but only short, panicked breaths came out. She was staring at the man she had just called a smelly garbage hauler, a man whose bespoke Italian suit and silk tie alone cost more than her son's luxury cars. She was staring at a man surrounded by federal agents, and the reality of her fatal mistake was finally breaking her mind into jagged little pieces. My father continued his slow walk toward the front of the room. The United States Marshals matched his pace perfectly. Their hands rested comfortably near their utility belts, their presence ensuring that nobody in that room dared to even twitch. Marcus tried to take a step backward to hide behind the mahogany bar, but his legs betrayed him. He stumbled and fell hard onto a velvet lounge chair, his face slick with a terrified sweat. He looked at my father with the wide, desperate eyes of a cornered animal, completely stripped of his arrogant doctor persona. Even Chloe, who had been violently thrashing on the floor just moments ago, went completely still. She released her grip on Trent's torn shirt and slowly pulled her knees to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible. Trent remained flat on his back, staring up at the federal agents with a blank, hollow expression. The Golden family of Atlanta was reduced to a collection of trembling cowards in less than half an hour. My father ignored all of them. He walked right past Beverly, right past Marcus, and stopped directly in front of me. The icy, ruthless demeanor that had terrified the entire ballroom melted away the second he looked at me. He offered a warm, proud smile. He reached out and gently placed his large, calloused hand over mine. "Are you ready to go home, Zoe?" he asked, his deep voice carrying a gentle affection that sharply contrasted the harsh reality of the room. I smiled back at him, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude for his unwavering support. "Almost, Dad," I replied softly. "There is just one last piece of business to take care of before we leave." My father nodded slowly. He squeezed my hand once, then turned his body to face the Harrison family. The warmth vanished from his eyes in an instant, replaced by a cold, calculating emptiness. He leaned slightly on his silver-tipped cane and looked directly at Beverly. Beverly flinched under his gaze as if she had been physically struck. She tried to push herself away from the wall, but her legs were completely useless. She looked around the room silently, pleading for someone, anyone, to intervene. But her wealthy friends were looking at the floor, absolutely terrified of drawing my father's attention. She was entirely alone. "You have a very loud voice, Beverly," my father said. His tone was conversational, which somehow made it significantly more terrifying than if he had shouted. "You had a lot to say on the phone 10 minutes ago. You had a lot of opinions about my daughter, my business, and my bloodline. I am standing right here now. I highly suggest you take this opportunity to say those things to my face." The ballroom was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the abandoned cocktail glasses. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Beverly shook her head frantically. "I am sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking and breaking. "It was a mistake. I did not know. Please, Elias, I did not know who you were." My father let out a low, humorless chuckle. "Ignorance is not an excuse, Beverly," he said, his voice projecting clearly to the back of the room. "You did not insult me because you thought I was poor. You insulted me because you believe poverty strips a person of their humanity. You thought my daughter was an easy target because you assumed she had no power to fight back. You built your entire life on the delusion that your bank account makes you superior to the people around you. He took one step closer to her, and Beverly let out a pathetic whimper, pressing her back flush against the glass window. But that delusion ends tonight, my father declared. You wanted to know what a truck driver can do. You wanted to know how a man with grease under his fingernails handles a problem. I am going to show you exactly how I operate. My father did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick envelope sealed with red wax. He tossed it casually onto the head table. It landed with a heavy thud right on top of the torn pieces of the divorce agreement. Open it, my father commanded. Beverly's hands were shaking too violently to even reach for the envelope. Marcus had to stumble forward, his fingers fumbling awkwardly as he tore the heavy paper open. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. They were stamped with federal seals and banking insignias. Marcus stared at the dense legal text, his eyes darting frantically across the pages, trying to make sense of the financial ruin laid out before him. Let me summarize it for you, my father said, his voice echoing perfectly through the silent ballroom. 6 days ago, my financial analysts flagged a massive portfolio of defaulted debt hitting the private market. The bank was trying to quietly offload several high-value non-performing loans to avoid a public scandal. I recognized the names on those loans immediately. It seems your brilliant son-in-law managed to leverage your entire ancestral estate, your medical clinic, and the collateral for this very country club. Marcus dropped the papers as if they were literally burning his hands. No, he whispered, shaking his head rapidly. No, we have 30 days to cure a default. The bank cannot just sell our property without giving us a chance to restructure the debt. A normal bank would give you 30 days, my father corrected him smoothly. But you did not borrow from a standard lender, Marcus. Trent took out high-risk, unregulated secondary mortgages through a shadow banking firm to avoid federal scrutiny. He signed away your grace periods. He signed away your right to restructure. And the moment he missed the third payment, the debt went directly to auction. My father leaned his weight onto his silver-tipped cane. Owens Freight has a very aggressive private equity division. We specialize in acquiring distressed assets. I bought your entire portfolio for 30 cents on the dollar. I paid in cash. And I did not buy it to restructure your payments. I bought it to execute the collateral clauses immediately. Beverly slid down the glass window, her knees finally giving out completely. She hit the floor with a pathetic thud, her expensive silk dress pooling around her. She looked up at my father from the floor, her face streaked with ruined makeup. The irony was absolute. The woman who had spent the entire night demanding that I be thrown back into the gutter was now quite literally sitting at my father's feet. You own our debt. Beverly choked out her voice, a hollow, broken wheeze. You own us. I do not want to own you, Beverly, my father replied, his tone dripping with absolute disdain. You are a terrible investment. I do not want your debt. I want what the debt is attached to. He turned his gaze away from her and looked slowly around the grand ballroom. The elite guests instinctively shrank back under his piercing stare. They realized that their exclusive sanctuary, the very symbol of their generational wealth, had just been conquered by a man they thought was a garbage hauler. They looked at Beverly and Marcus not with sympathy, but with profound disgust. In the world of high society, bankruptcy was an unforgivable disease, and the Harrisons had just been exposed as terminally ill. Finally, my father looked directly at Marcus. The United States Marshals standing behind me are here to enforce the immediate transfer of physical assets, he explained with lethal calm. The locks on your medical clinic were changed 20 minutes ago. The gates to your ancestral estate have been chained and padlocked by federal agents. And the management of this country club was legally transferred to my holding company this morning. Marcus opened his mouth, but only a dry, rattling gasp escaped. His entire world, his history, his carefully crafted identity had been legally erased in the blink of an eye. He was a man who possessed absolutely nothing, standing in a room full of people who would never speak to him again. My father stepped aside, gesturing toward me with a slight sweep of his hand. He looked down at Beverly, delivering the final crushing blow with perfect chilling clarity. You called me tonight and demanded that I bring my truck to haul away the trash. That is exactly what I am doing. He pointed his silver-tipped cane directly at the front doors. You told my daughter to leave your property, my father said, his voice ringing out like a judge delivering an absolute death sentence. But you are no longer a member of this club, Beverly. You are a trespasser. You are standing on my daughter's property, and I want you off of it right now. My father did not wait for Beverly to respond. He gave a subtle nod to the lead United States Marshal standing to his right. The federal agent stepped forward, his heavy boots echoing with absolute authority, and bypassed the shattered matriarch completely. He walked straight toward the dark corner where Trent was still lying in a pathetic heap, trembling uncontrollably. Trent, the arrogant finance broker who had started this evening by aggressively lecturing me on wealth management, did not even try to run. He did not have the strength. The marshal grabbed him by the collar of his ruined custom Italian suit and hoisted him to his feet effortlessly. You are under federal arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, and securities fraud. The agent announced, his voice carrying the cold, mechanical weight of the law. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. Trent let out a high-pitched sob, a sound so devoid of dignity that several guests visibly cringed. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the silent room. Chloe, who had been viciously attacking him just moments before, scrambled backward across the marble floor. She pressed her back against the wall, her eyes wide with terror, desperately trying to distance herself from the man she had proudly flaunted all night. She did not defend him. She did not promise to call a lawyer. She looked at him with pure, unfiltered disgust, realizing that being publicly associated with a federal criminal was the ultimate death sentence for her social standing. The marshals flanked Trent on both sides and began marching him toward the exit, his expensive leather shoes dragging pathetically along the ground. Beverly watched her favorite son-in-law being dragged away in chains, and the last remaining thread of her sanity finally snapped. She let out a hollow, gasping breath and collapsed completely. She fell hard onto the marble floor, right into the puddle of spilled champagne and red wine left over from Marcus knocking over the cocktail table. The dark red liquid rapidly soaked into the fabric of her expensive silk gown, making it look as though she were bleeding out right in the middle of her own gala. She lay there shivering, her perfectly styled hair falling in messy strands across her face. She reached a trembling hand out toward the VIP tables, silently begging her wealthy friends for help. She wanted someone to help her stand up. She wanted someone to defend her honor. She wanted anyone to tell her that this was just a terrible nightmare. But nobody moved to help her. In fact, the elite socialites of Atlanta did the exact opposite. They took a collective step backward, treating her like she was highly contagious. Then, one by one, the country club guests reached into their designer bags and pulled out their cell phones. Bright camera flashes began to pop across the room. The people who had been eating her food and drinking her champagne just an hour ago were now coldly recording her spectacular downfall. They zoomed in on her ruined dress, her smeared makeup, and her pathetic reaching hand. In their ruthless world, Beverly Harrison was no longer a queen. She was a cautionary tale, a viral video waiting to be posted to the private group chats of the true aristocracy. She had built her entire life on social validation, and now she was being socially executed by her own peers. Marcus realized that his empire was entirely gone. He had watched Trent get hauled away to federal prison. He watched his mother lying in a puddle of wine, completely abandoned by everyone she knew. He looked at the federal agents securing the doors, and the horrifying reality of his own future finally registered. He had no medical license, he had no money, he had no house. The senator would inevitably hear about this massive scandal by morning, which meant his wealthy new fiancée would disappear before the sun even came up. He was a complete ghost. Marcus turned slowly toward me. The arrogant smirk, the aggressive posture, the violent temper were all completely gone. His shoulders slumped, and his chest heaved with panicked breaths. He took 2 shaky steps toward me, and then did the one thing I never thought I would ever see him do. He dropped straight down onto his knees. "Zoe!" "Please," Marcus begged, his voice cracking, tears streaming down his face. "You cannot do this. We were married for 5 years. We shared a life together. I know I made mistakes. I know I was wrong. But you cannot leave me with absolutely nothing. Please, Zoe, have some mercy. Tell your father to call off the marshals. I will do whatever you want. I will sign anything. Just please do not take my life away." I looked down at the man who had promised to love and protect me, the man who had spent the last 5 years making me feel completely worthless. He was kneeling in front of 200 people, crying like a child, begging for a fraction of the mercy he had violently denied me just 30 minutes ago. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel a shred of forgiveness. Mercy is a privilege reserved for people who show remorse before they are caught. "Marcus," I said, my voice ice-cold and entirely steady, "you are not sorry for what you did to me. You are only sorry that you lost. You stood on this stage tonight and tried to publicly destroy me. You threw a $5,000 pity allowance in my face and told me to go back to the gutter. You brought this entirely upon yourself." I took a step closer, forcing him to look up into my eyes so he could see the absolute finality of my decision. "You have absolutely nothing, because you are absolutely nothing," I told him, delivering the final lethal blow to his fragile ego. Marcus buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with loud, pathetic sobs. He curled into a tight ball on the floor, weeping just a few feet away from where his mother was still shivering in a puddle of wine. The club manager, Charles, signaled to his own security team. They began moving methodically through the room, politely but firmly, instructing the guests that the Oak Ridge Country Club was now closed for a private transition of ownership, and that everyone needed to vacate the premises immediately. The wealthy socialites did not complain. They were eager to escape the suffocating humiliation of the Harrison family. They filed out in a hurried, quiet mass, stepping carefully around Beverly and Marcus, as if they were nothing more than discarded trash on the sidewalk. I watched the room empty out, leaving only the federal agents, my father, and the shattered remains of the people who thought they could break me. I walked back over to the head table where the torn pieces of the divorce agreement lay scattered among the broken crystal and the spilled champagne. I picked up the bottom half of the document, the exact page that held the empty signature line Marcus had been so desperate for me to sign. I reached into my clutch one final time and pulled out my heavy Mont Blanc pen. I twisted the cap off and clicked the cartridge into place. It was filled with bright red ink. I leaned over the table and signed my name with smooth, deliberate strokes. I did not sign it to surrender my legal rights or to accept their pathetic terms. I signed it as a final receipt. I signed it to officially release the Harrison family from my life forever. I turned around and walked over to where Marcus was still curled into a tight, pathetic ball on the floor. He was shivering violently, his face buried in his hands, completely broken by the crushing reality of his own actions. I stood over him for a long moment, looking down at the man who had caused me so much psychological pain for the past 5 years. I expected to feel some lingering anger or perhaps a flash of sadness for the marriage we once had. But as I looked at him cowering on the marble floor, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a profound, liberating emptiness. I let go of the torn piece of paper. It fluttered through the air and landed softly right on top of his head. He did not even flinch to brush it off. He just let out another loud, desperate sob. "Keep the pity allowance, Marcus," I said, my voice echoing cleanly in the vast, empty ballroom. "You are going to need every single penny of it to pay the security deposit on a very small apartment." I turned my back on him and walked toward the grand entrance. My father was waiting for me by the massive glass doors. He held out his arm, and I proudly looped mine through it. We walked out of the Oak Ridge Country Club together, our heads held high, leaving the smoking ruins of the Harrison Empire completely behind us. The crisp night air felt incredibly refreshing against my skin, washing away the suffocating toxicity of that ballroom. The United States Marshals stood at attention and tipped their hats respectfully as we passed them. The driver of the gleaming Maybach opened the heavy rear door for us, and we slid into the plush leather seats. As the door closed with a solid, satisfying thud shutting out the outside world completely, I looked out the tinted window one last time. Through the glass doors of the club, I could see Beverly finally attempting to stand up. Her ruined silk dress was heavy and dripping with cheap wine. She slipped on the wet marble and fell right back down onto the floor, utterly alone. I turned my head away, and the Maybach quietly accelerated down the sweeping driveway, leaving them all in the darkness. The image of the dark country club slowly blurs and fades away. The camera pulls back smoothly, dollying out to reveal the present day. I am sitting in my own living room, the exact same leather sofa from the beginning of our story. The warm, soft glow of the fireplace flickers across the expensive artwork on my walls. I take a slow, relaxing sip of my red wine and cross my legs, feeling completely at peace with the world. It has been exactly 1 year since that night. The fallout was spectacular, and the justice was absolute. Trent pleaded guilty to federal wire fraud and embezzlement. He is currently serving a 10-year sentence in a minimum security prison, completely stripped of his arrogant finance bro persona. Chloe was entirely cut off from her frozen accounts. She was forced to move into a tiny one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. The woman who had never worked a single day in her life is now working a retail job at a discount department store, wearing a terrible polyester uniform and ringing up the very same working-class people she used to mock. Marcus lost his medical license permanently and is currently facing a mountain of civil lawsuits from his former patients. His wealthy fiancée dumped him the morning after the gala and immediately changed her phone number. Because his reputation is completely ruined, the former Golden Boy surgeon is now working as a receptionist at a low-income walk-in clinic, answering phones for minimum wage. As for Beverly, she was completely exiled from Atlanta high society. Her elite friends blocked her numbers, revoked her prestigious charity board memberships, and pretended they had never even met her. She lost the ancestral estate, the luxury cars, and her country club access. She now lives in a rented trailer park 2 towns over. She spends her days clinging to her fake designer bags, constantly complaining to anyone who will listen about how the world is entirely unfair to her, completely unable to accept that she engineered her own destruction. My father and I, however, are doing exceptionally well. Owens Freight just acquired another massive international logistics firm, and my risk management portfolio has never been stronger. I finally have the peace and the respect that I always deserved. But more importantly, I have my absolute freedom. I learned that you cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you. Sometimes you have to be the one to strike the match and burn the toxic environment to the ground. I looked directly into the camera lens, resting my wine glass gently on my knee. I want you to remember this story the next time someone tries to make you feel small because of where you come from. Your worth is never determined by the opinions of arrogant people who inherited their entire identity. Keep your head down, do the hard work, and let them underestimate you. Let them dig their own graves with their unearned superiority. Never look down on a truck driver, I say, offering one final knowing smile to the camera, especially when you do not know what they are hauling in the back. It might just be your own sentence.